What is the church's greatest strength? There's different ways to look at the question, but I would start off by saying that the church is at its strongest insofar as it recognizes its weakness. The church is not designed to be a place full of bluster and sort of Roman or Greek heroism. It is the assembly of the needy, the coming together of those who were dead and made alive. Which reminds us in turn then that the greatest strength of the church is the church's redeemer, the church's husband, the church's reason for being. Jesus is the strength and the health of the church. The church, as I say, is at its best when it recognizes its absolute, total dependence upon the grace of God in Christ. When we looked last week at the church's greatest weakness, we spent some time talking about the problem of pride. And that what happens with pride is that we forget our need. We lean on our own understanding. And that's why, again, the church is at its best when it recognizes its need, when His strength is shown in our weakness. So how do we cultivate this strength? How do we strengthen the things that remain? There's so many weaknesses in the church in our day. There's always weaknesses in the church, which doesn't make them not serious. It just makes them all the more serious. But how do we push back against those weaknesses? Well, we don't do it by grabbing our bootstraps and lifting harder. We do it by being more and more obedient to our calling to faithfully preach the gospel. That gospel includes the bad news of our weakness, of our failures, of our inability to earn the favor of God and how we stand under His judgment in ourselves. That message has to be proclaimed. It's not a pleasant message. It's not a widely accepted message, but it is a biblical message, and it is the foundation upon which everything else comes, which moves on to the message that Jesus came to suffer in our place. It's by His wounds that we are healed. He experienced and took on the wrath of the Father, who was pleased to bruise Him in our place. He was the Lamb that came to take away the sins of the world. So we begin with our need. We move to His provision. And from there we move on to our assurance of all of God's promises. Not simply that we are forgiven, but that we are immutably forgiven, immutably loved, immutably adopted into the very family of God. We have the blessing and the approval and the love and the delight of the only one who matters, who coincidentally happens to be the one who knows everything there is to know about us. What would happen to the church if it were filled with congregations that understood those three foundational truths, that really got the reality of our sin, not just corporately in the abstract, but each of us grasping the scope of our own individual sin, that really got the suffering of Christ for us and the reality of His provision, and really got the sure and certain promises of God? We would not be afraid of the disfavor of the world. We would not be scrambling for positions of power and authority and bickering and biting one another. We would be at peace. And that peace itself would tear down the very strongholds of all those things which lift up their knowledge in opposition to the lordship of Christ. Our strength is resting in Him.